November 25, 1943, 11:47 hours, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Obergefreiter Klaus Schmidt, former Wehrmacht sergeant captured at Kasserine Pass 8 months prior, stood in the mess hall line with 247 other German prisoners of war and watched American camp staff carry in 23 roasted turkeys. Each bird weighed approximately 15 pounds. Schmidt had done the mathematics. That was 345 pounds of meat for 248 men. In the Wehrmacht, an entire company received less meat per week than these prisoners would consume in one meal. Standard protocol in POW camps said prisoners received rations sufficient for survival. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, but nothing more. Schmidt had expected bread, thin soup, perhaps some potatoes. What he saw being placed on tables violated everything he understood about how wars worked. In the next 4 hours, German POWs would consume more calories than most German civilians had eaten in a month. And the intelligence officers monitoring Camp Shelby would discover something that terrified American military leadership more than any battlefield defeat. This is the story of how Thanksgiving dinner in a Mississippi prison camp revealed the depth of American industrial superiority and changed how Germany understood the war it could not win. Klaus Schmidt grew up in Leipzig, working class, where his father managed inventory at a textile mill. The family ate meat twice weekly when times were good, once weekly when they weren't. Schmidt learned early that resources were finite and waste was sin. He joined the Wehrmacht in January 1940, age 19, believing Germany's victories would bring prosperity. The army fed him better than his family ever had. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, Schmidt was a corporal in North Africa with Rommel's Africa Corps. He'd participated in the victories at Tobruk and Gazala. American soldiers were rumored to be soft, poorly trained, equipped with inferior weapons. The propaganda said the war would be over by Christmas 1942. Schmidt believed this because he wanted to believe it, and because nothing in his experience suggested America possessed the capacity to defeat the Wehrmacht. February 19, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. American forces fought back harder than expected. Schmidt's unit was cut off, surrounded, forced to surrender after a 3-day fight that killed 47 of the 92 men in his platoon. The Americans who captured him wore uniforms that looked brand new, carried rifles that had never been fired before that week, and ate rations from metal cans that seemed to contain entire meals. One American soldier offered Schmidt a cigarette from a pack that contained 20 cigarettes. Schmidt's Wehrmacht rations included 5 cigarettes per week. He was transported to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, in April 1943. The camp held approximately 1,200 German POWs captured in North Africa. Schmidt was assigned to Compound C, Barracks 7. His bunk had a mattress. The latrine had running water. The compound included a small library with German books, a recreation yard, and workshops where prisoners could learn trades. This was nothing like the prisoner camps Schmidt had seen on the Eastern Front, where Soviet POWs died by the thousands from starvation and disease. By November 1943, Schmidt had been at Camp Shelby for 7 months. He worked in the camp workshop repairing furniture. He received letters from his mother in Leipzig, who wrote that food shortages were worsening, that butter and meat were nearly impossible to obtain, that civilians received 1,800 calories daily if they were lucky. Schmidt and the other POWs at Camp Shelby received 3,500 calories daily. This seemed impossible. They were prisoners. Prisoners should suffer. In November 1943, the war was turning. Allied forces had invaded Sicily in July, landed in Italy in September. The Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. German propaganda insisted victory remained inevitable, but the men at Camp Shelby had seen the American supply lines in North Africa. They understood logistics. They knew what infinite resources looked like. Camp Shelby's German POWs included educated men. Schmidt's barracks held a former university lecturer, 2 engineers, a banker, and 17 skilled tradesmen. These men could analyze data. They observed that Camp Shelby's American guards were well-fed, well-equipped, and rotated frequently. The guards wore uniforms that fit properly. Their weapons were clean and functional. The camp vehicles never broke down because maintenance was performed on schedule. Every system worked because every system had sufficient resources. The camp cook was Corporal James Washington, an African-American soldier from Georgia, assigned to Camp Shelby because the Army didn't trust black soldiers in combat roles. Washington ran the POW mess hall with mechanical efficiency. Breakfast at 0700 hours included eggs, bread, coffee. Lunch at 1200 hours included meat, vegetables, bread. Dinner at 1800 hours included soup, potatoes, occasionally fish. The meals were adequate, sufficient, nothing more. POWs didn't complain because they'd eaten worse in the Wehrmacht. But November 25th was Thanksgiving. Washington had informed the POWs 3 days prior that Thanksgiving was an American holiday celebrating abundance and gratitude. The meal would be special. Schmidt and the others assumed this meant slightly larger portions, perhaps an extra piece of bread. They didn't understand what abundance meant in America. The intelligence problem was this. German High Command needed to understand American production capacity. Reports from the field were dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Generals in Berlin couldn't comprehend how America could feed millions of soldiers, supply the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, maintain the British war effort, and still have surplus production for domestic consumption. The numbers seemed impossible. Someone was lying. Camp Shelby's intelligence officers monitored prisoner mail, conversations, and behavior. They knew the German POWs were writing letters home describing conditions that contradicted German propaganda. These letters were intercepted, analyzed, and filed. The officers understood that every letter describing American abundance was intelligence that could demoralize German civilians. But they faced a dilemma. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and American values demanded ethical behavior, even toward enemies. They couldn't mistreat prisoners to support propaganda, and they couldn't hide the truth about American capacity. November 22, 1943, 3 days before Thanksgiving, Corporal Washington briefed the POW mess hall workers on the upcoming holiday meal. Schmidt was assigned to help with setup. Washington explained that each prisoner would receive turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, green beans, rolls, butter, and pumpkin pie. Schmidt didn't understand half the items Washington listed. Stuffing was a concept that made no sense. Why would anyone stuff food inside other food? Cranberry sauce was unknown in Germany. Pumpkin pie sounded like something created by a damaged mind. Washington showed Schmidt the supply order: 350 pounds of turkey, 180 pounds of potatoes, 90 pounds of butter, 60 pounds of cranberries, 40 pumpkin pies purchased from a local bakery. The numbers paralyzed Schmidt. This was for 248 prisoners, one meal. The Wehrmacht fed entire battalions with less food for a week. Schmidt asked Washington if this was real. Washington replied that Thanksgiving was a small holiday compared to Christmas, when the portions would be even larger. That night, Schmidt lay in his bunk and performed calculations. The Thanksgiving meal would provide approximately 4,500 calories per prisoner. German civilians in Leipzig received 1,800 calories daily. American prisoners of war would consume in one meal more than double what German families consumed in an entire day. Schmidt understood that this wasn't about the Geneva Convention or humane treatment. This was about an economic system so productive that it could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own people. He discussed this with Otto Becker, the former banker in Barrack 7. Becker had been analyzing American economic capacity since arriving at Camp Shelby. His conclusion was simple and terrifying. America produced more than Germany could destroy. The Wehrmacht could sink American ships, shoot down American planes, destroy American tanks, and America would simply build more. The production differential wasn't tactical or strategic, it was existential. Germany was fighting an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Schmidt began observing everything differently. The camp guards wore uniforms that were replaced every 6 months. The mess hall received fresh vegetables weekly despite being in rural Mississippi. The camp library received new books monthly. The workshop where Schmidt repaired furniture had tools that were maintained properly, because replacement tools were abundant. Nothing was conserved because nothing needed to be conserved. This was an economy of surplus, and surplus changed everything about how wars were fought. November 25, 1943, 11:30 hours. The mess hall was decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves that seemed absurd to Schmidt. American holidays involved decoration even in military prison camps. The tables were arranged in rows. Each prisoner had a metal tray, metal utensils, and a paper napkin. Schmidt had not seen paper napkins used casually in Germany since 1941. Paper was a strategic resource. America used it for napkins. At 11:47 hours, Corporal Washington and his kitchen staff began serving. 23 turkeys emerged from the kitchen, roasted golden brown, steam rising. Schmidt watched American soldiers carve the turkeys with electric knives, devices he'd never seen before. The meat fell away from the bone in thick slices that were placed on trays. Each prisoner received approximately 10 ounces of turkey, white and dark meat both. This was more meat than Schmidt's mother had eaten in a month. The stuffing came next. Washington explained it was bread mixed with herbs, celery, and onions, cooked inside the turkey. Schmidt tasted it and couldn't understand why bread needed to be prepared this way, but the flavor was remarkable. Rich, savory, unlike anything served in Wehrmacht mess halls. The stuffing alone contained more butter than Schmidt's family had seen in 6 months. Mashed potatoes followed. Not boiled potatoes, not roasted potatoes, but potatoes that had been peeled, boiled, mashed, then mixed with milk, butter, and cream until they achieved a texture that seemed almost luxurious. Schmidt calculated that the milk alone in these potatoes cost more than a German family's weekly food budget. Gravy was poured over everything, a sauce made from turkey drippings that tasted like distilled abundance. Cranberry sauce arrived in small bowls, translucent red jelly that tasted sweet and tart simultaneously. Schmidt learned it came from a can. America had industrialized fruit preservation to such a degree that seasonal berries could be served year-round in prison camps. Green beans were served with almonds, another touch that seemed insane. Almonds were luxury items in Germany, reserved for special occasions. Here they were garnish for vegetables served to prisoners. The rolls were fresh baked that morning, soft white bread with butter served in individual portions. Schmidt ate 3 rolls and could have eaten more. The butter was real dairy butter, not the synthetic fat replacements common in Germany. Each prisoner received approximately 2 ounces of butter, more butter than Schmidt's family in Leipzig had consumed collectively in November. By 12:30 hours, Schmidt had consumed approximately 3,000 calories. He was uncomfortably full. Then the pumpkin pies arrived. Each prisoner received 1/8 of a pie served on a separate plate with whipped cream. Schmidt had never tasted pumpkin before. The pie was sweet, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, and the whipped cream was real cream that had been sweetened and beaten into foam. This dessert alone was more elaborate than any meal Schmidt's family had eaten since the war began. He looked around the mess hall. 248 German POWs sat in silence, eating food that contradicted everything they'd been told about America. The propaganda said Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of sustaining a war effort. But decadent societies didn't feed their prisoners feasts. Weak economies didn't produce surplus for enemies. Schmidt understood in that moment that Germany had lost the war, not on battlefields but in factories, farms, and supply chains that could produce abundance even during total war. At 13:15 hours, prisoners began returning to their barracks. Many carried leftover rolls in their pockets because there was too much food to consume. Schmidt overheard conversations in German. "This is better than officers' mess in Berlin. My family would think I'm lying if I wrote about this. How can we be losing to a country that treats prisoners this well?" That afternoon, Schmidt wrote a letter to his mother. He described the Thanksgiving meal in detail, knowing American intelligence would read it before it was sent. He didn't care. His mother needed to know what America was capable of. The letter was intercepted, translated, and filed in Camp Shelby's intelligence archives. Similar letters from dozens of POWs created a pattern that troubled American officers because they revealed the propaganda value of simple abundance. November 25, 1943, 1400 hours. Schmidt returned to Barrack 7 and lay on his bunk, still uncomfortably full. Otto Becker, the former banker, was writing calculations in a notebook he'd been keeping since April. Becker looked up and said, "I've been tracking American resource allocation since we arrived. Today's meal cost approximately $1.50 per prisoner. That's $372 for 248 men. One meal. The Wehrmacht spends less than that feeding an entire company for a week." Schmidt asked if Becker thought Germany could win the war. Becker replied that Germany had already lost. The question now was how long it would take for German leadership to accept mathematical reality. Every month, America's production increased while Germany's decreased. The gap wasn't narrowing, it was accelerating. Becker estimated that by mid-1944, America would be producing more aircraft per month than Germany's total operational air force. The intelligence value of Thanksgiving dinner became apparent when Camp Shelby's censors reviewed prisoner mail. 47 letters described the feast in detail. The letters were honest, factual, and devastating to German morale. Prisoners wrote things like, "I ate better today than my family has eaten in months," and "America feeds its enemies better than Germany feeds its soldiers." These letters couldn't be sent without editing, but editing them would reveal American censorship and undermine the perception of free communication guaranteed by the Geneva Convention. Captain Robert Morris, Camp Shelby's intelligence officer, faced a dilemma. The letters were accurate. They contained no military secrets. They simply described a meal that demonstrated American economic capacity. Morris understood that these letters, if delivered, would demoralize German civilians more effectively than any bombing campaign. But they also revealed American values. Even enemies deserved humane treatment and sufficient food. Morris approved the letters for delivery with minimal redaction. By December 1943, German intelligence had received dozens of reports from Camp Shelby describing conditions that seemed impossible. Prisoners reported 3 meals daily, medical care equal to American soldiers, work opportunities that paid small wages, recreational facilities including sports equipment and musical instruments. The reports were dismissed as American propaganda, until too many independent sources confirmed the same information. German High Command began investigating. December 1943 through March 1944. Word spread through Camp Shelby's German POW population that American holidays meant extraordinary meals. Christmas dinner on December 25, 1943, included ham, roasted chicken, potatoes, multiple vegetables, and desserts. New Year's Day 1944 brought pork and sauerkraut, a traditional German meal that shocked prisoners because America had bothered to honor German customs. Easter 1944 included lamb and ham together, another display of surplus that defied logic. Schmidt became an informal leader among POWs in Compound C. He spoke English reasonably well and served as liaison with Corporal Washington's kitchen staff. Through these interactions, Schmidt learned about American agricultural systems, mechanized farming that produced surplus crops, refrigerated transportation that prevented spoilage, industrial food processing that extended shelf life indefinitely. Washington explained that America grew so much food that the government paid farmers to reduce production. This concept was incomprehensible to Schmidt. Pay farmers to grow less food. In Germany, every acre was cultivated to maximum capacity. Other prisoners reported similar observations. POWs who worked in camp maintenance noted that broken equipment was replaced rather than repaired because new equipment was cheaper than labor. POWs who worked in the camp hospital observed that medical supplies were discarded after single use because sterilization was more expensive than manufacturing new supplies. Every system at Camp Shelby operated on principles of abundance rather than scarcity. By spring 1944, German intelligence had compiled comprehensive reports on American POW camps. The reports confirmed that prisoners across multiple camps received similar treatment. Camp Shelby wasn't an exception. It was standard procedure. This information was classified and shown only to senior German leadership because it undermined the propaganda narrative that America was a weak, decadent society on the verge of collapse. Wehrmacht officers who read the reports understood immediately what this meant. Oberst Heinrich Müller, assigned to analyze Allied economic capacity, wrote in a classified memo dated March 1944, "American treatment of prisoners reveals production capacity that exceeds our most pessimistic estimates. They feed enemies better than we feed soldiers. This is not charity. This is mathematical demonstration of surplus. We cannot compete with an economy that treats prisoners as luxury consumers." The reports reached some German field commanders by April 1944. Their response was pragmatic: surrender to Americans rather than Soviets because American captivity offered survival. This preference became doctrine among Wehrmacht units in Western Europe by summer 1944. German soldiers began deliberately seeking American forces for surrender rather than fighting to the last man as propaganda demanded. The quality of American POW camps became a strategic weapon that cost nothing and defeated enemies through kindness. Klaus Schmidt remained at Camp Shelby until May 1945, when Germany surrendered. He was repatriated to Germany in August 1945, returning to Leipzig to find his mother alive but malnourished, his father dead from complications of malnutrition in March 1945. The city was devastated. Food shortages were worse than during the war. Schmidt's experiences at Camp Shelby had prepared him for this contrast but couldn't soften it. He worked in reconstruction, rebuilding homes and businesses in Leipzig through 1946 and 1947. He never spoke publicly about his time as a prisoner of war except to say that Americans had treated him fairly. In private letters to Otto Becker, who had returned to Hamburg, Schmidt wrote that the Thanksgiving feast at Camp Shelby had been the moment he understood. Germany had lost not just the war, but the entire ideological conflict. A society that could afford to feed enemies' feasts was a society that had solved the fundamental problem of resource allocation. Schmidt married in 1948, had 3 children, worked as a factory manager until retirement in 1978. He died in Leipzig in 1993, age 72. His obituary in the Leipziger Volkszeitung mentioned his Wehrmacht service and time as a POW, but focused on his contributions to post-war reconstruction. His children recalled that their father kept a notebook from his time at Camp Shelby, filled with calculations about American production capacity and notes about the Thanksgiving feast. The notebook was lost after his death. Corporal James Washington left the Army in 1946, returned to Georgia, and opened a restaurant in Atlanta that served traditional Southern cooking until 1982. He occasionally told the story of cooking Thanksgiving dinner for German POWs, emphasizing that feeding people properly was more powerful than propaganda. Washington died in 1989. His restaurant had served over 1 million meals in 36 years, and he was proud that none of his customers ever went hungry. The intelligence value of American POW treatment became clear in post-war studies. American treatment of prisoners cost approximately $150 million annually, but generated strategic benefits worth billions by encouraging surrender and demoralizing enemy forces. The policy was continued through Korea and influenced Geneva Convention revisions in 1949. Modern military doctrine recognizes that humane treatment of prisoners is both ethical requirement and tactical advantage. November 25, 1943, lasted 4 hours. In that time, 248 German prisoners consumed 345 pounds of turkey, 180 pounds of potatoes, 60 pounds of cranberries, and 40 pumpkin pies. They learned that America fought wars differently because American values required treating even enemies with dignity. The meal cost $372. The strategic value was incalculable. Klaus Schmidt understood that day what German leadership refused to accept. Wars are won by economies that can sustain abundance, not armies that can inflict destruction. America didn't defeat Germany through superior tactics or braver soldiers. America defeated Germany by building a society so productive that it could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own people. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Share this with anyone who believes that values and economics matter more than violence in determining historical outcomes. Comment below. Where are you watching from? Have you heard other stories about how American abundance changed World War II? Thank you for keeping these stories alive. We honor the courage of those who fought and the wisdom of those who understood that strength isn't just military. It's the capacity to remain human, even toward enemies.